Okay, good evening. This is Thomas Fried on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right, folks. We're back. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, I got some stuff I want to get into, so let's just get right into this. We are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need support of the members of the listening audience to keep the network operating and the broadcasts coming. So, if you enjoy the shows, the information, the lectures, the discussions, the topics, and the guests, and the discussions on the other shows, as well as this one, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website. That's just one long big string, LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com, and get signed up as a subscribing member. And you can listen online, of course, through that website, through the online listening link that connects you to our online broadcasting. So, if you're not there already listening in, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the website and get signed up. Every membership counts, and we do need the support of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating. And if you want to become fully informed on the fraudulent and unconstitutional nature of the IRS's income tax enforcement that America has suffered for the last 75 years, basically since the end of World War II, you need to find your way over to taxfreedom.com, start reading, get educated, get informed, because the Supreme Court has just taken the IRS apart. And nobody in the country seems to realize the consequences of what they have done in the Moore decision in reviewing the constitutional foundations for all taxation and declaring that the federal income tax is an indirect tax and that all direct taxes must still be apportioned. Now, why is this important? Because for the last 50 years, the IRS, the DOJ, the federal district courts, and the circuit courts have been trying to tell the American people that the income tax is owed because it's a non-apportioned direct tax under authority of the 16th Amendment, all of which the Supreme Court said is a fraud. It's not a direct tax. It's not a non-apportioned direct tax. It's not under the 16th Amendment, and it's not a tax without limitations on all sources. It's an impost, a duty, or an excise, or rather a function of impost, duty, and excise, taxation, indirect taxation under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. It's not a direct tax under the 16th Amendment at all. The federal government, the courts, the district courts, the circuit courts have been lying to the American people. They've been lying to the American people about the nature of the tax. There is no direct tax that is constitutionally authorized unless it is apportioned to the states for payment. There is no constitutional authority to enforce a direct tax against the American people. There is no constitutional authority to tax the fruits of labor derived from the exercise, the people's exercise of their right to work. Rights are not taxable activities, and the exercise of the right is not a taxable activity, and rights are not taxable property. You can't tax the right, neither the possession of it beforehand, nor the exercise of it after the fact, nor any of the fruits of labor that flow to the individual citizen as a result of that exercise of the right. The whole thing has been a constitutional fraud since the victory tax expired in World War II. The whole thing has been a constitutional fraud. An entire constitutional fraud. And the proof is none of the money taken from the paychecks goes in the United States Treasury. How do you prove that? Well, just look, why do you have to file? You have to file to pay tax, but the tax should have already been paid according to the law because they deducted it from your pay, they collected it, and every penny of collected tax has to be deposited into the U.S. Treasury on a daily basis. That's Title 26, Section 7809. Every penny collected for tax must be deposited in the Treasury. Regulations modify the cycle to weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, or quarterly, and most employers send in the withheld taxes on a quarterly basis, which means on January 10th, or sometimes, well, actually by January 1st or 2nd or 3rd, because your employer sends in the last batch of withheld taxes at the end of the year on December 31st at the end of the quarter, or January 1, 2, or 3 as soon as they get back to work after the holidays. So the money is sent, it's deducted, it's taken from your pay. They tell you it's taxed. The law says it has to be deposited in the Treasury, and a receipt has to be created showing the name, amount, and account number to which the tax paid is to be credited. And that, of course, would be your Social Security number, your name, and the amount deducted for the federal income tax from your paycheck. And that means that you should not have to file a return to pay tax unless you want a refund, because the tax has already been paid by virtue of it being taken from your pay and required by law to be deposited into the United States Treasury. But it isn't deposited into the United States Treasury, is it? Because there's no credit for any tax paid in your name until you file a return and convert the credit for the money withheld from your pay to a credit for tax. But what happened to the money they took from your pay if it didn't go in the Treasury like it was supposed to by law? Because, of course, tax is money for the government to spend. And if it isn't in the Treasury, Congress can't spend it, and Congress has control of the purse. They spend the money by writing appropriation bills against the funds in the Treasury. And if there's no funds in the Treasury, they can't spend it. So it must not be tax, because otherwise it would have been deposited into the Treasury. And that's right, it's not tax. The income tax was never imposed on the earnings or fruits of labor of the American people, except those working in Canada between 1918 and 1993. That's where Section 61 originated in 1918, not in 1913. And it originated as the sources of income subject to taxation by a citizen working in Canada under the 75-year-long tax treaty. And the tax treaty has absolutely no application whatsoever as domestic legislation. In other words, Section 61, gross income, has been fraudulently applied to the American people since the end of World War II. It was only law enacted as part of a tax treaty, not with general applicability to the American people as domestic legislation. That's part of the constitutional fraud that's been perpetrated by judicial legislation, where the judges ignore the legislative history, ignore the actual language in the statute, and make up their own interpretive version of that language by adding words to it that aren't there in the statute. And that's exactly what they've done with Section 61. Salaries and wages are not listed in Section 61 as a source of taxable income. Salaries and wages were removed from Section 22A, which was the predecessor to Section 61. Salaries and wages were in it. They were part of Section 61 in its original enactment in 1918, taxing the salaries and wages of citizens in Canada under the treaty. But after World War II, and getting away with the victory tax as an unconstitutional direct tax on the labors of all American people under the guise and pretense of a 2-year war revenue measure to pay off the war debt, it was an unconstitutionally direct tax, but nobody complained. They got away with it. And when it expired at the end of World War II, they decided they were going to keep on taxing the work, labor, the wages, and the salaries of the American people, but they were going to do it in a way so that the statute wouldn't actually be an unconstitutional statute. So they removed salaries and wages from Section 61 and left compensation, and then just waited for some socialist-minded judge to go, oh, look, compensation is taxed by Section 61, and salaries and wages are a form of compensation. So salaries and wages are taxable, and everything you do from here on out makes you a federal slave. No one is free anymore. We're directly taxing everything you do under a tax treaty that doesn't apply to you in the 50 states. But by changing by changing the section number from 22A to section 61, not publishing the connective history in the United States Code, they were able to deceive the judges in the legal industry, the attorneys, as to the nature and extent of applicability of Section 61, which has no domestic applicability. They just waited for a judge to decide that salaries and wages were compensation, and thereby rewriting the law through judicial legislation. He made everyone in America a communist slave, changing the income tax into the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. And they mean on all labor, on all work, on all earnings. Everything belongs to the state. You're just a slave. They could take it all if they wanted. So federal judicial legislation and federal judicial fraud with respect to the original Bruchaber decision is how we've got to the point today where the government is enforcing not the indirect impost, duty, or excise, where income is used to measure the amount of the impost, duty, or excise that is owed on the activity or the earnings that were derived from the activity that was subject to the federal impost, duty, or excise. But if there is no impost, duty, or excise that applies to the activity or transaction, you don't just tax the yardstick income and make the man a slave. It needs to be earnings derived from foreign activity, foreign import, foreign exports, exports to foreign countries, imports, exports, foreign persons in foreign places, that's impost and duty, excise is commodities, licenses, and corporations. If the earnings are derived from something other than any of those taxable activities, it's not a taxable source of income. It's constitutionally exempt from federal taxation, because it's not subject to taxation by impost, duty, or excise, and you can't tax labor directly under the 16th Amendment. That's what the Supreme Court just said in June in Moore et Ux v. the United States, 22-800. It's all written up on taxfreedom.com. The Supreme Court has reaffirmed what they said in Bruchaber originally, which is that it is not a direct tax. It is not an amendment that relieves direct taxation of any limitation. It is still an indirect tax under Article 1, Section 8. And by reaffirming the original decision Bruchaber, they have directly canceled the circuit court's arguments, which all referred to Bruchaber, without actually citing any of the text in the Bruchaber decision. They just said, Bruchaber said it's a direct tax without apportionment. And that was a lie, that was a fraud, that was them reversing the Supreme Court's upholding of the limitation and unleashing the federal socialism that has led to the decline of the quality of life in America since the 1960s, when these socialist nonsense began getting ushered in. Regulatory deference under Chevron, affirmative action. The solution to discrimination is reverse discrimination. It's all nonsense, Roe v. Wade. Yeah, right, where's that in the Constitution? Where is any health care, medicine, or insurance in the Constitution? There's no authority for federal law in any of these arenas. None of them. And Obamacare wasn't a tax. It was an unconstitutional mandate to buy, or you get penalized without authority to do so. That was one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in history, rewriting it. Judicial legislation by Chief Justice Roberts. That's how far the perversion and subversion of the judicial authority has gone. Chief Roberts is committing the crime of judicial legislation, rewriting the code for Congress, because what they wrote is unconstitutional. So we'll fix it for you. We'll just call it a tax. Pelosi swore up and down she wasn't writing a tax. Okay, I think I hear the first commercial break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Find your way over to taxfreedom.com. Get educated, wake up, and Find your way over to libertyworksradionetwork.com. Get signed up as a subscribing member. We'll be back in 5. What are we doing here? Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and we're going to get right back into it. So, as I said, what we've got is constitutional fraud. It's been perpetrated by the federal judges on the American people for 50 years. It's where the insurrectionist rebellion has occurred, not on January 6th by Republican protesters in a mostly peaceful protest. The insurrection has been occurring in the federal courts, where they have been enforcing the second plank of the Communist Manifesto instead of the Constitution, where they have intentionally reversed the Supreme Court's clear decision in the Brushaber decision and used it to enforce communism on the American people. It's got nothing to do with federal taxation, and they know it. And that's why none of the money collected from you goes in the United States Treasury. Where does it go? It goes the same place where all the money goes that's sent in with the Form 1040s on April 15th, which again isn't going in the Treasury. You fill out a tax return, you sign it, you send them a check. That's supposed to go in the Treasury. But if you want to know where it goes, get the check from the bank. Ask them to provide you with a copy of the check, both sides, front and back. Turn it over and see who cashed it. If you think you're paying tax, if you are paying tax, what it should say is deposit to the U.S. Treasury, just like what's required under Section 7809. You got to deposit collected tax into the Treasury. So if what you paid was tax, what it will say on the back of the check, because if you want to know what's going on, you never read the instructions and listen to what they say, you follow the money. You want to know what's going on, you follow the money. And the way to follow the money with a check is not to look at the front where it was supposed to go. You look at the back to see where it actually went. And what it says on the back of your check, just like everybody else's, is pay to any FRB. It doesn't say deposit to the U.S. Treasury. It says pay to any FRB, Federal Reserve Bank, a private corporation. Why is a private corporation cashing your so-called tax check? The law requires it to be deposited in the Treasury. Why isn't it being deposited in the Treasury? Because it's not tax. You're voluntarily allowing them to withhold it. You're voluntarily filling out the form. You're voluntarily sending money to support the government. It's not tax. There's no tax imposed on your right to work. There's no tax imposed on your salaries or wages. It's all been made up by the judges. And none of the money goes to the Treasury. It goes to the Federal Reserve Bank, a private corporation. And the consequence of this is, of course, come September or October, when a hurricane hits in Florida or an earthquake hits in California, Congress runs over to the Treasury to draw on the tax revenues that have been accumulating there all year long. They're going to get $2 billion to give to FEMA to go help the emergency victims. And what happens when they get to the Treasury? That's right. There are no revenues to draw on because there have been no revenues accumulating there. They've all bypassed the Treasury illegally, unconstitutionally, in a system of seditious treason. Treason and insurrection. Oh, there's no money in the Treasury. What do we do? What do we do? Well, you know what they do. They borrow another $1 trillion. 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 50, 60. And as long as the American people allow their labor to be used to collateralize the never-ending growing debt, the thieves at the Federal Reserve Bank will continue to lend to the idiots in Congress. And the people will continue to be betrayed by a system that enslaves them to the servicing of the debts of their masters on the Hill. It's just not Plantation Hill anymore. It's Capitol Hill. The corporations play the overseers. The country in its entirety is the peonage plantation, being run by the master on the hill, Capitol Hill Congress, who enslaves all the good little peons and serfs to his debts by giving them a little plot of land, your job, to work at all year long. But come harvest time, you don't get to keep the harvest and the fruits of your labor, because the master comes around and tells the peons and the serfs how much of their annual produce they have to turn over to the master on the hill so that he can service his debts to his whores, his gambling buddies, his royal court, his defense munition suppliers, and, of course, his debt to his king. And you're the peon. Congress is the master on the hill, the corporations are the overseer, and the king running the whole plantation is the Federal Reserve Bank. And that's why all the money collected goes to the bank to collateralize the debt. It doesn't go in the treasury to fund the operation of the government. You are enslaved to the $36 trillion in debt, which will soon be 40 and then 50. It's not a system that serves America. It's a system that's helping the global elitists build their one world government. And in the end, it will come at the expense of the American people, at their enslavement and expense. It's already been done. They've been enslaving the American people since the end of World War II, and they got away with it with the victory tax. They've been lying to you about Section 61. They've been lying to you about your role in the tax system, which is not as the subjected person from whom the tax is taken or upon whom the tax is imposed. Your role in the tax system is the proper role of the sovereign under the statutes that actually exist. You're the withholding agent. You're the collector of the tax, who withholds money from payments made to non-resident aliens and foreign corporations, along with all the corporations doing business with them. Everybody doing business is made a potential tax collector as a withholding agent who has a duty to collect money by withholding money as tax from payments made to non-resident alien persons and foreign corporations. That's what's in the original Income Tax Act of the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act. A tariff is an impost. An impost is the taxation of foreign activity. And that's what's taxed by the original Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913, the original income tax legislation. It's a tax that requires collection of tax from foreign persons, not citizens. And that's what's reflected in the 1939 law. And that's how the tax was imposed until World War II, when they used the victory tax to, for the first time in history, have the government attach itself to the labors and fruits of labor, the wages and salaries of the American people working in all of the factories and munition plants that had been converted to war munitions production. So, what was World War II, where taxing the labor was first done to America? And after World War II, they just let you continue it by asking for withholding on a W-4 that you had no business having taken from you. You're not the subject of the tax. When the victory tax expired, the tax on the peoples of the American wages and salaries died. It doesn't exist. And they've used regulatory deference to try and create liability under Section 1 tax imposed. Well, regulatory deference under Chevron is gone. You have to go to the statute. The statute doesn't even impose a tax on any person. It imposes it on taxable income. And it doesn't address liability. The statute that addresses liability for tax is 1461, which says the withholding agent, the collector, is liable for what he's collected from foreigners, just like they did 32 years later when they created a new class of collectors called employers in the 1945 Subtitle C tax legislation, where they made the employer liable for the tax that's been collected by withholding from the employee. The employee's not liable for any tax. He just asks for it to be withheld, And then the employer, the collector, is made liable. It's classically indirect. Just like what they did in 1913 with collectors of collecting tax from non-resident aliens and foreign corporations. Foreign persons have the tax collected from them in 1913. Employees have the tax collected from them by asking for it, not because there's a mandate. It's because you asked for it on the W-4. Everybody needs to claim exempt and stop filing. Form 1040 isn't required by law. You can't identify any form in the law from the law anymore because they removed the requirement when it started causing them to lose cases in court. What I'm talking about, of course, is how the law reflected from 1986 to the year 2000 that the only form required by the tax imposed was Form 2555, foreign earned income. You only pay tax on what you earn in a foreign possession or a foreign country. There's no tax on domestic earnings. That's constitutional right. It's constitutionally prohibited. So they implemented the same sort of indirect collection at the source that the Supreme Court identifies in the Bershaber decision as the scheme of the tax that was implemented in 1913. It's not a direct tax. It never has been. There's no liability for it in the name of the wage earner. Liability exists in the name of the collector who withheld the tax. Liability has been alleged under Section 1 through regulatory pronouncement. But the regulation tries to do more than the statute. And in allowing the regulation to be used to create liability directly from the name of the wage earner, you transform it into a direct tax without apportionment. The only persons who work, who earn the money, who are liable are the non-resident aliens. That's done in Treasury Decision 2313. That's how pure the statutory indirect implementation of the scheme was. It doesn't even make the non-resident aliens liable. Only the collectors. So the Treasury said in 1916 after Bershaber, well, what happens if the collector doesn't collect it? Oh, well, they had Treasury Decision 2313 declare the non-resident alien is liable for the tax if the collector doesn't collect it. They had to make them liable by Treasury Decision because it's not in the statutes. It's a perfectly indirect scheme of collection at the source, where only the collector is made liable. The same way that in a sales tax, only the store is made liable for the payment of the sales tax collected. The customer isn't made liable. If the store fails to collect the tax, the state doesn't go to the store and get the names and addresses of the last 10,000 customers so they can go knock on their door and get the 4 cents from them. There's no liability in the name of the customer. The store was supposed to collect the tax. And when they fail to do so, the store is liable for the payment of the tax. Not because that's the way it's imposed, but because they lost the opportunity to shift the burden by not administering to the duty to collect the tax at the cash register. Now, in the income tax law, the law doesn't provide that the withholding agent, the collector, will be liable for the tax if it's not collected properly. It only says he's liable for the penalties and the interest for the failure to collect, but he's not liable for the tax. So the Treasury people said, well, how do we collect it? If he's not liable and the alien's not liable, how do you collect it if it's not been collected? So they wrote Treasury Decision 2313 to make non-resident aliens, the recipient of the taxable income, liable if it wasn't collected by the payer of the taxable income to the foreign person. Okay, it sounds like we're coming up on the second break. I had actually intended to talk a little bit about what's happening in the government right now. I guess we'll do that in the third semester. Okay, we'll be back in 5 minutes. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. I do want to encourage you again to find your way over to the website, get signed up, and find your way over to taxfreedom.com and get informed. Okay, this is Thomas Fried on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and let's just get right back into it. Freedom comes from God, not government. And the truth shall make you free, for God is the truth. God's true plan for mankind is freedom through faith in God and His truth. If you misplace your faith in any other entity, be it man, king, emperor, shah, theory, philosophy, agenda, church, whatever else you place your faith in besides God, it will be used against you to betray you and enslave you to whatever entity you misplaced your faith in. And that's the history of mankind's government and his institutions. Faith in God is the path to freedom. There is no other. Okay, so what are we happening in government? Well, you got the Department of Government Efficiency. Oh, you didn't think I meant talking about this government, do you? The current administration is gone. It's just gone. It's a sea of senility and stupidity, ineptitude, incompetence, and virtual ignorance. Biden is wandering around the planet, getting ignored, reporters yelling at him to answer a question, getting left out of pictures that he wanders away from. It's a dementia cover-up of the highest order. Because, of course, if he's not competent to run for president, he's certainly not competent to be president. He's proving it every day. He's escalating the Ukraine-Russia into World War III by giving Ukrainians long-range missiles. He's running money out of the budgets as fast as he can to bring in as many illegal aliens and deplete the budgets before Trump takes office. He's doing everything he can to destroy America before the Republicans come back in and salvage it. And the only question left about this dementia, senile piece of crap is whether his legacy will be the destruction of America through bad inflation, bad energy policy, and bad war policies, both in the Middle East and with Russia, or will he manage to save his legacy by giving America their first female president by resigning so Kamala can be president for 30 days? Yeah, well, we'll see. And of course, the Democratic states, the blue states, have already started saying they're cranking up their legislatures to Trump-proof the California law, and they're not going to cooperate with the mass deportation of illegal aliens. And I say that if that's what they're going to do, Trump should have them arrested under Title 8, Section 1324, which is the code section I've read before, which is bringing in and harboring certain aliens, which makes it illegal to bring in, transport, house, give a job to, encourage to stay, shelter, protect, or prevent arrest of any individual who's here illegally. They'll all be violating Title 8, Section 1324. They'll be conspiring to bring in, harbor, shelter, transport, move, and protect illegal aliens, and they should be prosecuted under federal law. Prosecute the state governors, prosecute the city administrators, prosecute everyone who thinks California can pass state law regarding federal immigration or illegal aliens. They can't. It's a constitutionally federal jurisdiction, and only the federal government has jurisdiction for it. They can write as many state laws as they want. If they violate the federal law, they're going to jail. That's what Trump should do. Is in sanctuary city administrations, they should be arrested and tried in federal court for harboring and sheltering and aiding and abetting illegal aliens under Title 8, Section 1324. It's a crime. And they're openly saying they're going to commit crime to prevent Trump from fixing the immigration problem, which the Democrats broke and created by bringing 10 million at least 10 to 15 million illegal aliens into the country to overwhelm all of the social services throughout the border cities along the Texas, Arizona, California borders, and overwhelm the social services in every single one of the cities where they're accumulating, i.e. the Democrat cities, New York, Chicago, LA, San Francisco. And surprise, they're all going to want federal money, aren't they? Oh, yeah. They don't want to use federal money to throw them out. They want to use federal money to turn them into Democrat voters, because they're dependent upon government welfare for their existence. They're dependent upon them for the credit cards, the food stamps, the housing, and the hotels. They're dependent upon them. They're buying the votes by reprioritizing the budgets and spending them on foreigners instead of Americans, homeless veterans, and others in America who need the help much more than illegal aliens are entitled to it. They're not entitled to any of it. And to prevent the states from interfering, they should just arrest them. Go in and arrest them, including judges. This says if you shelter someone, that means if the judge lets him go out the back door to avoid ICE, he's aiding and abetting. Arrest the state judge. Prosecute him for violation of immigration laws. Arrest them. Don't let them get away with committing the crime. Arrest them. So, I guess the only other thing that's happening, of course, is Trump is assembling his cabinet at breakneck speeds. And Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are talking about being put in place at the Department of Government Efficiency, which isn't really a government department. Let's go through this. The cabinet that Trump has appointed so far, I've got this coming out of the Epic Times. Of course, you got J.D. Vance as his vice president, that we knew from the election. And he immediately announced that Susie Wiles was going to be his chief of staff. She's the one that kind of ran things from the campaign for him. Elise Stefanik is going to be the U.S. ambassador to the UN, and was a sharp New York congressman. I liked her. I think that'd probably be a good pick. Lee Zeldin is the administrator of the EPA. Mike Waltz is going to be the national security advisor. John Ratcliffe is going to be the director of the CIA. Let's hope they can clean that place up. That's obviously an anti-American mess. That's where, the 51 security analysts, ha ha ha. Oh, it's Russian disinformation. That's not a laptop you should be looking at. Just lied. They rigged that election with that lie. That was all the evidence of the Biden family corruption, guilt, the money records, everything. And they just lied about it and ignored it. They should all be put in prison. Oh, that was John Ratcliffe, going to be the director of the CIA. Pete Hegseth is going to be the Secretary of the Defense. There's a lot of people making noise about that, but he's a war veteran who served in the combat troops. And right now what we need is somebody sympathetic to the combat troops, not the generals who have gone off their rocker with woke nonsense. Nonsense. Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. Tulsi Gabbard is the Director of National Intelligence. And Robert F. Kennedy is the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Doug Collins is going to be the Secretary of the VA. Doug Burgum is Secretary of the Interior, which I'm one of those folks that thinks maybe the Department of the Interior should be abolished entirely. The states are managing the Interior just fine. Any function of Interior could be bundled into state. But that's me. Okay, Chris Wright is the Secretary of Energy. We obviously need to change the energy policy and get back to promoting the cheapest possible price for gasoline by promoting as much drilling as fracking as possible to restore national energy independence so that we become in charge of the price of the oil. can keep the quality of life affordable for Americans by keeping energy cheap and prevent Iran and Russia from having the budgets to wage war and terrorism around the planet from selling oil at higher prices than $50 a barrel. That's our best weapon, is the reduced price of energy. That keeps the enemy at bay, and Biden just handed them the arsenal. Here you go, $120 a barrel. Go ahead, we'll go to war. And they did. Sean Duffy is the Secretary of Transportation. Howard Lutnick is the Secretary of Commerce. And if you saw the news today, you know that Matt Gaetz, the nomination for Attorney General, has decided to step aside, recognizing that it was probably going to be impossible for him to get confirmed in the Senate. There were just too many Republicans opposed to his taking the position, so he's going to have to pick somebody else. And the real news, of course, is the government, DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency. And, you know, I got just a few minutes left here. The Epoch Times got a good little article. Let's go ahead and read for 4 minutes. The President-elect Donald Trump is set to launch the new Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, DOGE, which he introduced during a pre-election interview on billionaire Elon Musk's social media platform, X. Musk and former Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy will co-chair the effort, which aims to massively reduce government spending and reform or remove entire federal agencies. The pair are tasked with cutting the federal government's roughly $6.75 trillion spending in 2024 and hacking through a labyrinth of executive branch regulations. Together, these two wonderful Americans will pave the way for my administration to dismantle government bureaucracy, slash SS regulations, cut wasteful expenditures, and restructure federal agencies, Trump wrote in a statement. It will become potentially the Manhattan Project of our time. Republican politicians have dreamed about the objective of DOGE for a very long time. How they will accomplish that effort, however, is unclear, experts told the Epoch Times, especially since DOGE, which Trump said will serve an advisory capacity to the White House and the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, may encounter roadblocks in its efforts to drive large-scale structural reform. Here's a breakdown of what DOGE is, what its goals are, and what to expect from the project moving forward. After the initial announcement, Musk moved quickly to create an X account for DOGE. Trump explained that DOGE will make changes to the federal bureaucracy with an eye on efficiency to drive out the massive waste and fraud in the federal government's multi-trillion-dollar annual spending. Yet, despite that, it has the word department in its name. DOGE is not, despite that it has the word department in its name, DOGE is not a federal agency like the U.S. Government Accountability Office, GAO, which audits the federal government for Congress. Trump has made it clear that DOGE is an advisory board operating outside the federal government. Jordan Herring, Director of Fiscal Policy at the American Action Forum, told the Epoch Times. Thus, unlike federal agencies, it does not need to be formally enacted through an act of Congress. DOGE, Herring said, would work to identify inefficiencies and waste within the federal government, like the GAO, but the latter works at the request of congressional committees and is mandated by public laws and committee reports. Exactly what DOGE will be doing in its day-to-day operations is still unclear, according to Herring. No official explanations have been given regarding oversight, and Trump has suggested that it would operate outside the federal government while remaining under his authority in an advisory capacity. DOGE could end up being nothing more than a glorified advisory board or an outside entity with significant influence. So, there's more here. Again, I'm reading from the Epoch Times. It's an article from the New York edition, November 20th, 2026. The Epoch Times is an excellent paper. I occasionally read from it on the show because everything is DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency. What is it? How's it going to work? It's being defined. It's vague and fuzzy, but basically it's Elon and Vivek telling Trump, here's where you can cut money. What they really need, of course, is a line item veto. If the president had a line item veto, then you could save a lot of money on the budgets, but they don't want to do that. So that's something the Republicans might want to think about giving Trump now that they have the House, the Senate, and the executive. A line item veto is what presidents have wanted for a long time. We'll be back next week with more.